few years back, up in the Northeast, there was a police department in Connecticut, and they added an additional dispatcher to their overnight shift. They only had one working the overnight shift, and so they thought as a matter of precaution, as a matter of safety, we're going to add another one. Well, the person who was predominantly responsible for that overnight shift, the one, launched some complaints, some vehement complaints, saying we don't need another person on the overnight shift. I have this. Subsequent investigation found out that the reason this guy was so opposed to having more people working that overnight shift was that he was sleeping on the job during that overnight shift. Security cameras found on multiple occasions that the dispatcher was reaching for pillows and a blanket and would head to the right. Yeah, they found this is one of those screenshots.
He was taking a break.
Right, yeah, he's taking a long break. And he'd go off to their equipment room and he'd lay down and take a nap. So he was fired. But as part of that investigation, they found that two others on that overnight shift that had been added to the overnight shift were also taking pillows and stuff to the break room and sleeping on the job. They were fired as well. The Madison, Connecticut Police Department then assured the public, hey, your safety was never at risk, no calls were missed. And the interesting thing is, you sit there and we read that story and our thoughts immediately begin to think, safety is at risk, right? And obviously that's why they were then fired. Those kinds of stories, they don't give us a lot of confidence in our police and our fire departments. And we haven't had that, I don't think, here in Los Fresnos. But when we think of the police department, we think of the fire department, we think of them 24/7, 365, the military as well. And the reason law enforcement, the reason fire, the reason the military are important 24/7, 365 is it gives us a measure of comfort, a measure of feeling safe. And alleviating fear is really what is happening there. Because if we don't have the police on call 24/7, 365, if we don't have the fire department, if we don't have the military guarding and protecting, we don't feel safe. We feel like our health or our lives are at risk, and that creates fear. Many of us felt fear during COVID. I know I did, especially when you're talking to the doctor, and the doctor has a frown on his face as he looks at the data that's coming out of your body. I have felt that fear. We even have a term for this. Those people that have been through some significant health crisis, we call them a health scare, right? I had a health scare. Well, we're putting words to what happens to us when the doctor's news is not all that great. And the scare means it was worse, or the news seemed worse at the time. We lived to tell about it. We got well, but then we term it health scare because at the time it created fear. Our health was at risk. Into this big subject of fear, into these types of conversations, into those moments even when we feel like our health is at risk, when we feel like our safety or our lives are at risk, comes this question, a question that is at the heart of the story that we just read. And the question is this: why do you fear? Why do you fear? What's the reason for your fear? Do you know the reason why you fear? It's a great question. Why are you afraid? And Jesus is the one asking that question. Jesus is the one that wants us to take stock of our fear through that question. He's asking us that question, even as he asked his disciples, why do you fear? So of all the questions that Jesus could ask in this moment, this story we just read in the middle of a storm, he's asking, why do you fear? And the reason he's asking that question is, again, he wants his disciples, he wants us to take a step back, look at our moments of crisis, look at our conversations, and ask ourselves, what is it that is causing us to fear? Why is it that we fear? Because once we understand what it is that is causing our fear, we then begin to see where our heart orientation is. We begin to see what our hearts are racing after. We begin to see what it is that really is our object of our faith. Am I trusting my health? Am I trusting my life? Is my trust in the police department? There are all sorts of things in which my faith can be turned away from the one who really should be the object of my faith. That's why he asked that question in the middle of all this today. So when we come to the story in Mark chapter 4, Jesus and his disciples are, again, and you see this from time to time as you read these biographies of Jesus in the New Testament, they're trying to get away from the crowd. Jesus, by this time, even early in the book of Mark was writing a biography. Even early in the biography, Jesus is trying to get away from the crowd. He's already what we would call a rock star. He is in demand. He's the guy everybody's going to see. You know, he's on the marquee. He's the big show. And so Jesus, he says, we got to get away. We got to go. And the disciples go with him. So they're going away from a crowd. And it seems like there's always something about to happen every time this happens. Every time they're going away, it's interesting. These biographers, they knew what they're doing because this is exactly how it's going down in Jesus' life. Every time Jesus seems to be moving away from the crowd, something happens. It's like in the middle of trying to find rest, trying to find respite that they desperately need, something happens. And that happens to us, by the way, right? I think Emily said to me this week, why can't it, this always seems to be at an inconvenient time. Right? Always tends to be inconvenient. That seemed to be the case for Jesus. Every time he's just trying to be by himself and get some rest, stuff happens. So they get into a boat. He says, we're going to cross to the other side of the sea. They get into a boat, and this is what happens. Mark 4:37. A great windstorm arose. The waves were breaking over the boat, so the boat was already being swamped. And there's that word, swamped. That's what's causing some angst. That even causes us angst when we read it, right? Boats are supposed to provide us safety from the water. Water is a very dangerous thing, even in the Bible. It's a tool of judgment. It's something that can kill you. It is something to be feared, especially when there's a storm. And so we build boats to protect ourselves from dangerous waters, but this boat is not doing a very good job of protection. So there's a few characters in this story that we need to see. The first one is the boat and the waves. That's the first character of the story. You see this boat that's supposed to be protecting them from a storm, not doing a very good job. You see waves, you see the storm that is overtaking the boat. That's the first character. This is the kind of the part of the crisis. This is creating the crisis. This is creating the angst. What's funny is, as Mark is writing his biography of Jesus in this story, he mentions there were other boats crossing with them across the sea. This seems to be the only boat having this problem. Makes you wonder. We read some things from the Old Testament in which God raises up storms in order to do something. Sometimes it's the evil one raising up storms to do something. We don't know who's behind this, but it does make you wonder. There's only one boat that is experiencing the storm this way. But there's another main character in the story. It's the one where the spotlight falls on, and it's on Jesus. Jesus. And where's Jesus as Mark is writing? You know, he points the camera at Jesus, and he points the camera at Jesus in the middle of all the stuff going on with the boat and the storm, and Jesus is sleeping. Jesus is sleeping. And this storm is not going to wake him up. That amazes me. And of course, again, Jesus has his purposes and has his things going on. But we see Jonah even. In the story that was read earlier, he's sleeping in the middle of a storm. But there's one more set of characters. And they're kind of caught in between Jesus, who is sleeping in the boat, and the storm that is threatening to overtake the boat. The boat is being swamped. In between Jesus and the storm is another set of characters. And that's the disciples. What are they going to do in the midst of all this? Are they going to side with Jesus? Jesus is asleep, seemingly content with what's going on. Or are they going to side with the waves? Are they going to side with the storm? Is that where their hearts are going to go? Well, we figure where they're going to go, right? They're caught in between these two things, and they make their choice. Their heart goes to the storm and the waves. Goes to the storm and the waves. And here's their response. Here's what tells us that they're, instead of shifting toward Jesus, they've shifted away from Jesus, and now they're looking at the storm and the waves. They turn back to Jesus, and then this is what they say. The disciples woke Jesus up. And they said to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die?" So whatever's going on with this storm, their response is anything but normal. They're shocked. It's almost like they're shocked beyond belief that Jesus is asleep. There's a little bit of, how can you sleep when all of this is going on? They're shocked. There's also fear. There's also frustration. But there's also a bit of accusation. Let's look at this closely. Here's their question. Don't you care that we're going to die? Don't you care that we're going to die? It's almost as if the whole thing just kind of escalates quickly. Instead of just waking Jesus up and saying, "Hey, we've got this storm going on," they escalated to, "Don't you care that we're going to die?" It's almost like it just comes right out of the mouth. And the question has two parts, and both parts just expose what's going on in the hearts of the disciples. The first part is, don't you care? Don't you care? Think about who they're saying that to. They're saying this to the one they've seen do miracles, the one who has been their companion, the one who has been with them, the one who they've said is the Son of God. Don't you care? That's the first thing. That's kind of unbelievable. But then the second thing is, we're going to die. We're going to die. They're in the boat with the creator of the universe, the one who has the keys of life and death, the one who started this whole big ball. We're going to die. We're going to die. This would seem like it's an exaggeration, but it's also presuming an unknown outcome. They don't know that they're going to die, but they've already arrived at this conclusion. We're going to die. Now, that whole question, we see all sorts of things wrong with it. Don't you care? And then the second thing is, we're all going to die. And it's very easy for us, 2,000 years later, to sit and read this story like, what a bunch of buffoons. That's not us. We get all self-righteous. We get all high and mighty. That wouldn't be me. This is us. This is us. We've all been there. We may not say this out loud, but when the storm hits, when the crisis seems to be swamping our boat, when it seems like we're losing our faith, when it seems like life is threatening our very belief, our very identity, this goes through the mind. Don't you care? I'm going to die. We jump to the next conclusion. Jesus wakes up. what's funny about Jesus waking up in this boat, the way Mark is writing it in his biography, Jesus doesn't even talk to the disciples. Jesus gets up, and they've woken him up. Don't you care, we're going to die. And instead of talking to the disciples, which I would have done, by the way, right? Who do you think you're talking to? Who do you think I am? That would be me. Now, Jesus, he wakes up, and the first words out of his mouth are aimed at the storm. He says, he rebuked the wind, said to the sea, "Silence, be still." And the wind ceased. Doesn't talk to the disciples, talks to the storm. Now, I also have to think, as he is looking at the waves, as he is looking at that storm, and he's saying, "Silence, be still," there's also a part of me that thinks he's also talking to his disciples. Silence, be still. But that's exactly what happens with the storm. I mean, now you can hear a pin drop. And then he does turn his attention to the disciples. And things are so quiet, I'm betting that the other boats can probably hear what's next from Jesus. Jesus says to his disciples, "Why are you afraid? You still have no faith." And he challenges everything in their question. He challenges this idea that he doesn't care. He challenges this idea that they're going to die. He says, "Why is it that you are afraid? Why are you all afraid?" Again, it's very easy for me to sit and recoil after the first question. Why are you afraid? Remember, I said this is the story. This is the question of the story. Why are you afraid? If I'm Peter, I'm scoffing internally when he says this. What do you mean, why are we afraid? See the storm? See the waves? We still have water in the boat. They haven't even bailed the water out. Jesus is saying, why are you afraid? Why are you afraid? Jesus asked the second question, and nobody is then scoffing. Do you still have no faith? Bang. See, those two things go together. Why are you afraid? Now Jesus is tying this whole thing of being afraid in the storm to faith. To faith. You don't believe me, do you? You don't believe me. I mean, this must have shocked the disciples. Again, if it were me, then I had the ability to somehow calm the storm. I calm the storm, and I immediately begin pointing fingers. Why'd you wake me up? I could have been asleep by now. I could still be asleep right now. All this stuff. But he doesn't. You see, Jesus is aimed at their heart. He's aimed at our hearts as we read this. He wants us to consider these questions in our own lives, in our own storms, especially when these storms tend to swamp our faith, our belief. Sometimes we are in storms that threaten or seem to threaten our very salvation itself. Jesus, what kind of Savior are you? How many of you have felt that from time to time? And it all arises out of fear. Fear is coming from a lack of control. But Jesus is showing them, you all along have had this question, don't you care? That's all coming out of hearts that don't believe. You're not believing the one who's asleep in the boat. Asleep in the boat. That brings us to the third question that's actually part of this whole story. When the disciples see the storm go down, and then they hear Jesus' question, they then are terrified. It says, why are you afraid? In the very next thing, but they were terrified. Only this time, they're not terrified of the storm and the waves. What's causing their fear now? It's Jesus. Jesus. They say, who then is this? And this is the question they're asking. This is the question that Mark's readers are asking. This is the question we would be asking. Who then is this? Who then is this? See, Jesus' rebuke doesn't necessarily erase all the fear. In fact, it intensifies the fear, but the object of this fear is now Jesus. Jesus has their attention. They're fearful. And in that moment, when Jesus says, why are you afraid? Now they're asking, who then is this? He's wanting them to see that in this whole thing, the wind and the waves were not their worst concern. The worst thing that could happen to them in their minds was that they would be swept away by wind and waves. And he is telling them, he is showing them, and they are now realizing that there is something bigger to be feared. It's Jesus himself. Jesus himself. That Jesus is bigger than the storm. You know what the worst thing that can happen to them in this storm is for Jesus not to be in the boat. The worst thing. We have to convince, that's why we come here every Sunday. We have to remind ourselves of this. It's why we won't stop talking about the necessity of Jesus being with us. Because the moment Jesus is with us is the moment we are condemned. Is the moment we are doomed. Is the moment we are damned. The worst thing that could have happened to them on that lake is for Jesus to be missing. Who then is this? The who then is the one who created the lake. He's the one who created the storm. It's the one who controls absolutely everything. The one who is king over all. But there's something else going on in this story that we tend to miss. We come to this story, and again, we tell this story to our kids. I learned this story as a little grasshopper. Yeah, little Chad. The little Chadster. I hear you. That's what he's thinking. I hear this, and the whole point of the story is we're supposed to see Jesus as God, as if this is what Jesus is doing in the moment. In fact, a lot of our Bible stories, we tend to read that way because that's the way we want to read it. We're always looking for Jesus as doing this. Now, this is true. Jesus obviously is God. He is powerful in the moment, right? That's not really the point. Again, that's why we're looking at these questions. He wants us to see what's going on in our hearts. But there's something else that he does in this story that is almost mind-blowing. And if the disciples had understood what was happening, this is why Jesus says, have you no faith? Look at this. This is the very beginning of the story. Mark 4:35. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus told them, let's cross over to the other side of the sea. Jesus is saying, let's cross over. He's not making an offer. He's not making, he's not expressing some kind of a hope. When the God of the universe, when the Savior of mankind says, let's cross over to the other side of the sea, what's supposed to happen? What's going to happen? They're going to cross over to the other side of the sea. The one who created the wind, the one who created the waves, is saying, let's cross over to the sea. And look what happens in Mark 5:1. This is on the back side of the story. They came to the other side of the sea. Came to the other side of the sea. So this whole story happens in between these two verses. You got Jesus telling them, let's cross over to the other side of the sea. Next slide. And they came to the other side of the sea. What happened in between? This is the promise. So when Jesus says, when they wake him up and he says, why are you so afraid? Don't you have any faith? This is why. He's already given them a promise. We're going to the other side of the sea. That's why he's asleep. You understand that Jesus is in this promise. Jesus is asleep. There's a storm that comes, and Jesus is sleeping at the bottom of the boat. Why? Because Jesus, even in his sleep, is guaranteeing their safety, is guaranteeing that they're going to cross over to the other side of the sea. Sleeping Jesus can accomplish that in the midst of a storm. Now for us, we get this is what happens in the middle of it all. Next slide. Jesus tells them to cross over the sea. They crossed over to the other side of the sea. It actually happened as he promised. In the middle of it all is a storm. And in the middle of it all is Jesus' word, Jesus' love, Jesus' grace in the midst. They had his promise. There was a crisis, and in the middle of the crisis, Jesus calms the storm, and in grace, he's pointing out what's going on in your heart. Why are you afraid? And at the very end of it all, they crossed and came to the other side of the sea. It happened. Just like he promised. And this isn't to minimize what's going on here. This is very real stuff. I mean, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about all the stuff that goes on inside me and in my crisis and what's going on in my life. I'm not hearing this. I'm not reading this. All I see is crisis. But in the middle of that crisis, Jesus is there. Jesus is with us. And even if he's sleeping, he has me. He has you. Now, we know he's not sleeping. Well, that's in the story. That a sleeping Jesus is good on his word. So when we have crisis, when we have storm, when life is upside down, when our very faith is being challenged, we're rocked by life, we're rocked by sin, seemingly no way out, all we see is crisis, we have Jesus' promise, we have Jesus' word, that he has us. That he has us. That the creator of the universe, the one who does control it all, the one who is in charge of all the waves, the seas, and whatever else is going on in my life, that he's giving me his promise. He's giving me his word. This is the one who said, I will never leave you or forsake you. That's his promise. And so, as we move in our lives from the promise to the promise being fulfilled, sometimes this happens in our lives in little situations. The ultimate fulfillment, obviously, is the new resurrection. But whatever. In the middle of it all, we've got Jesus' word. We've got Jesus' presence. We have his love. We have his grace. That's Jesus for us. In that moment, let's pray.